And so I think leaders don't necessarily see failure as a bad thing. Failure is like, all right, that's one way that didn't work. Let's figure out the way that does work. I don't think leaders like freak out about failure. Hey, that's a good line. Leaders don't freak out about failure.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast, Identity and Influence. Today, we are talking about leadership lesson 13. Leadership is situational. And of course, we have our resident identity specialist with us today, Dr. Lem Usita. What's up, man?
Yes, sir. Always good to be on here, man. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation as always.
These conversations have been helping a lot of people. I know you've gotten some feedback, and so have I. Today, we are talking about leadership lesson 13. Leadership is situational. And you mentioned to me right before we started, should we even do this one because it's so simple? And then you answered your own question and said yes. What made you think that?
Yeah, I think it's simple because it's just a part of leadership, but you and I think deeply about leadership. We teach it, we read about it, we study it. And so that's why we're sharing our ideas on it. And I think it's worth sharing this because when I was first in executive leadership, it took me a while to understand, oh, this leadership is situational and you can't just we'll talk about it, but you can't just transfer these leadership principles into a situation without taking a look at the context. Leadership is a situation depending on the context, depending on the people, depending on the time of the year, depending on the systems that they have, what the leadership culture is, whatever the specific leadership or whatever the specific situational context is, you're going to have to adjust leadership accordingly. You could be at the same organization and go through the same things two different times and it'll be different because it'll involve different people. It'll be, a different situation. Even though it might be the same thing that happens, the second time is going to be different. It won't be a carbon copy of what happened before. And your leadership needs to be adjusted so that it can, so that you can, I think what we do is we read a book, right? We'll read Maxwell's book or Lencioni or whatever. And like, if we get the principles in our head, we're like, okay, well, I could just do this. No, you have to take those principles, those leadership principles and make them fit for the situation. And then you'll be effective. You can't just like, well, this is what Maxwell said to do. It doesn't work that way. You have to take a look at the context that you're in. You have to look at the people, the relationships, the community, all of it. And situational leadership just makes those leadership principles fit that particular situation.
So why do you think so many leaders tend to default to rigid, step-by-step leadership? I'm just going to do what Lencioni says. I'm just going to do what Maxwell says. Why do people rely on those models instead of adjusting to the specific context?
Yeah, I think the first reason is it's easy to just stick to the model. And then the next reason is I think it's lazy to not take a look at the specific context. And then when it doesn't work or it takes longer, then you're like, well, it doesn't work. It works. You just didn't take the time to take a look at the situation. You need to assess where you're at and you need to figure out what it is that you're doing so that you can lead effectively. I think it's lazy to just stick to the model. I think it's not as effective if you are taking a look at what's happening in the specific context. And again, I say this and it sounds so simple, but we have to learn it. Like young leaders need to learn it.
You mentioned that leadership principles stay the same, but the application depends on the situation. So how can leaders learn to hold those principles constant while staying flexible in the way that they apply them?
Yeah. So I'm not saying don't read the leadership books and don't study the principles. The principles work, but you can't just take that principle into the situation. You need to assess the situation. So hold on to the principles like they work, but then maybe in a particular situation, I think people tend to overlead sometimes, like, oh, I'm going to just do this because this is what the book said, or this is what leadership should look like. And then they totally miss it because the situation didn't necessarily call for that. And so the staying flexible in how to apply them really is just smart. And really, it's just wisdom to know when to wield leadership and when you can just kind of chill and step back, or how much leadership you need to wield, how much power you can listen to our episode on power to kind of understand that there are 5 power bases. And then to know which particular power base to use in a particular situation will make you effective. Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Let's talk about the role of change in leadership. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, once said, the only constant is
Yeah.
change. And you highlight that if you're truly leading, change is going to be constant. Why is it important for leaders to be comfortable navigating constant change?
So I would add a little caveat. One of the things that I say is if you're reacting, then you're not leading, right? And so if you are truly leading, then none of it is a surprise to you. Does that make sense? Like, because you're aware of your situation, you're not surprised by that. You're not reacting to things. You're actually leading change. And so navigating it is a lot easier because you're not reacting to something. And so yeah, I think it's important for leaders to be comfortable with change because it truly is constant. It's always happening. But if you're working hard at your leadership practice, if you're reflecting and evaluating, you're building a leadership culture where there's trust and you're building those relationships, like that's the leadership stuff that you do in order to create that situational leadership that's effective. And then you can stay on top of things.
Can you share a real world example, maybe from your own leadership experience, where you had to shift your leadership style due to unexpected changes?
Man, there are so many examples. When I was vice president for student life as an executive at college, there was a fire that came through and we had to shut her down, right? And we had to find places for everybody to live, because we had to shut down the dorms and, like we were all evacuated. And so figuring out like, how to do that, like it almost was too much for me because there's hundreds of students and we need to find like spots for them. And so I want to like lead through that, but it was just a little too big and a little too fast. And it was great that the team got together and I had to let go of like, oh, this is my responsibility and allow people to help me in that. That's a situational thing. Would I have liked to be in complete control of that? 100%. But I didn't have the time. I didn't have the resources. I needed the help. And so like, if I would have just held on to that, then, like it wouldn't have gotten done as quickly had I not adjusted and given up some of that responsibility and the team helped out. Does that make sense? Like, so if you feel like you need to be completely in charge all the time, if you can't like let go of some stuff, like that's a situational thing. And there was nothing. And when this happened, I was actually out of town at a conference. And so I was at an academic conference somewhere else and I had to fly back and get stuff done. But in my absence, people had already done stuff. And like, there was a part of that I needed to let go. I mean, there are so many situations, so many surprise situations, you know, uh, typically of students getting in trouble when you're working with, 18 to 22-year-olds, like there's bound to be some felony charges in there and, like broken things. One kid went missing for like a week. He didn't tell anybody. He just like took off. You know what I'm saying? And like, he didn't tell anybody and he's still our
Yeah.
responsibility. So you see what I'm saying? Like there's just all kinds of things where like, if I need to be the one to lead through all of that, like, I mean, you just kind of have to adjust and allow people to help. Those are the examples that come to mind.
Towards the end of the article, you connect situational leadership to contingency theory. For our listeners, can you explain what contingency theory is?
I wrote about situational leadership and I explained all of it. And that's just what I called it. And then I read about contingency theory, which is just the technical term for situational leadership, right? All it is having the flexibility and the adaptability in your leadership to make the necessary changes in order to lead more effectively. So it's basically the same theory. Situational leadership is what I called it. And then when I studied and I learned it, I'm like, oh, the technical term for it is contingency theory. So, I mean, it's what we've been talking about. That's just the technical term for it.
How can a leader assess the key variables within that? The task, the team, the environment, when deciding how to lead in a given moment?
Yeah. Again, you take the leadership principles, right? Stuff that Lencioni, Maxwell, any of those leadership principles, and then you take it to your particular situation. And then you make it fit your situation. And so part of situational leadership is having situational awareness of what's happening with the team, what's happening. This is the task. What's happening with the environment? What's happening with the organization at that particular time? What's happening with the government? What's happening with the fires that have broken out, which causes us to, evacuate and stuff. And so like situational leadership, situational awareness is just another way to kind of take a look at, okay, in light of the situation, this is how I'm going to lead. And again, you're the leader, the leadership principles all still kind of work. But I think if you don't take a look at your situation and if you don't have situational awareness, you can lead against the organization. You can lead against yourself. Having all of those variables figured out, task, achievement, environment really helps you have a better picture of how you can better lead. Again, it sounds so simple. It's it's just, I mean, it shows up in the literature. And the reason why it shows up in the literature is because people don't think about this kind of stuff.
The great thing about situational leadership is that leadership itself is built on situations. If you're not put in situations that are going to cause you to make decisions, either good or bad, if you don't have those variables, you're never going to become a better leader. Great sailors aren't made on the shore. They're
Yeah.
made great on the seas. That's why we need to be flexible. That's why we need to be able to adapt.
You also don't know how you're going to feel. You don't know what it feels like to receive criticism. You don't know what it feels like to be under pressure. Like it's insane when you're in an executive leadership position. You'll face all kinds of things that you've never faced before. You know what I mean? That they can't like necessarily write playbooks for because it's situational. And in that case, like, this is who I am. These are my leadership abilities. What is it that I'm going to do in light of this situation?
What makes leadership, especially situational leadership, such a creative process?
Yeah, I would say that the principles is the science, right? These are, it really is truly the science because it's what the research literature says. Here are the principles. And then when you take those principles and you move them into situational leadership, when you have situational awareness about what it is that you're doing in leadership, that's the art, right? The principles don't change. Then how do you use these principles to effectively lead? And that's the art part. Like when you read those leadership books, it tells you what the principles are, but it doesn't tell you how you operationalize those principles. They're all situational. That's the art.
Why is it critical for leaders to be willing to experiment, innovate, and fail?
When you're not willing to experiment or innovate, like leadership is innovating. It's challenging the status quo. And if you don't want to experiment, if you don't want to innovate, then you're just managing. You're managing. This is where I'm at. I'm going to just manage being here. Leadership kind of has this forward motion to it. This always improving, always getting better. And so I think leaders don't necessarily see failure as a bad thing. Failure is like, all right, that's one way that didn't work. Let's figure out the way that does work. I don't think leaders like freak out about failure. That's a good line. Leaders don't freak out about failure. They'll
Why not?
try, they'll experiment, they'll innovate, and so I think it's just part of leadership to want to get better.
In the leadership roles that you've had, can you remember a moment when you used creative thinking to navigate a leadership challenge?
Yeah. So when back to my vice president for student life days, where a lot of these lessons, I was given a directive. You're an administrator as a VP, right? So you get like, you just get some directives from up above. And the directive was, you need to find X amount of money, right? And then their solution to that problem was fire this person because that's exactly how much money that we need. And I thought about that and I was like, like I could fire this person, but the opportunity cost would
Right.
cost more than the money that I would save. Right. And so what I ended up doing is like, I went back to him and I said, I need to find this money. If I need to find this money, I'm going to keep this guy, but I'm going to fire these three other part timers because the opportunity cost is too much to get rid of that guy. The students love him. Right. And he is key to this place. And if you fire him, it's not just saving the money. Like you're going to hurt people. You're going to hurt people firing three other people, but not as much and not as deeply as if you fired this one guy. And so when it comes to this idea of, a challenge, and it worked, he ended up being there for many, many years and we worked through it. But like, yeah, again, that's a situation where they, I was handed a directive there. They told me to fire this one guy and I came back and I said, hey, let's get creative with this. If we fire this guy, this is what's going to happen. These are the opportunity costs and it's going to be way more expensive. than doing this. And they went with it, because it was, the smart thing to do. So that's what we did.
Let's talk about applying situational leadership in all areas of life. Some people listening might not see themselves as traditional leaders.
Yeah.
How do you see situational leadership applying to people like parents, teachers, coaches, community leaders?
I mean, it's again, it's so simple. You take the principles you might find in any leadership book, and then you just take a look. Really, this lesson is about taking a look at your situation, having situational awareness, and then moving forward accordingly. And so, I mean, as a parent, I'll teach it. Like, I just learned, I mean, I'm a parent, I'm a new parent, right? Like, I have a 20-month-old, and my wife sent me a reel, of the processing, the amount of time that it takes for a 20-month-old to process your information. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, I hear it, and as soon as I hear it, I decide whether I want to do it or not, because I have the cognitive ability to do that. I'm in my 50s. When you say, and I've actually seen other parents, like, they say they give a directive to their kid, and then they expect the kid to like listen and obey just as fast as they communicated it. And I realized that, like, man, this kid it takes him at least 10 seconds for him to
Yeah.
process what you just said, and maybe another 10 seconds to decide whether they want to do it or not, which means I need to have patience. And honestly, if I have patience, they do, like, my kid. It's so amazing. Like, now that I know that, I just wait 20 seconds in order to get the stuff done, and it gets done. And then I don't get frustrated at him. I don't say things that I mean, you know what I mean? I don't, like, force the situation. It only took 20 seconds. Now, did it take longer than I wanted it to? Not really. Like, it's just the situation. You see what I'm saying? And so, you can take these principles and use them in any situation, as a parent, as a teacher, as a coach, as a community leader. Most of it is just taking a look at your leadership and chilling out, taking that pause. So, yeah, man, you can use it. These things work in any situation.
You mentioned the concept of grassroots change. How does situational leadership empower people at every level of an organization or community to lead effectively?
Man, there's just something, I recently was talking to a consultant at a search firm, and we were talking about micromanagers. And, micromanagers, when they're telling you what to do, one, they're not building trust. But then two, then people are doing it out of a sense of duty and not out of a sense of, like, loyalty or a context of trust. At the grassroots level, when you're aware of your people, when you're aware of the relationship, when you're aware of the community, when you build that leadership culture, when you can create that culture of trust, I mean, then you don't have to lead, because they're just doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing, on the grassroots level. Whereas that micromanager is just constantly like, do this, do this, do this, do this, because that's his style. He never built up, like, that loyalty or that trust where people want to just do the right thing. And so when I think of that concept, like, that's the thing that comes to mind.
You mentioned that embracing situational leadership brought you a sense of freedom. So, how did this mindset shift affect your own growth and your leadership effectiveness?
So I think part of this has to do with my strength finders. Like, I'm an activator, command, I have those strengths. But one of the strengths that I have is individualization, and taking a look at the particular individual and empowering them to lead according to how they're made, according to the personality. And so when you can find the right fit and the right personality to do the right thing, leadership's easy. You know what I mean? Because they're working out of their gifts and they're working out of their strengths. And so understanding people and understanding that leadership is way more efficient if I get the right people in the right place. That really just helps me. You're almost not leading anymore, because, people know what their job is and they're just doing the right thing because you've got the right person in that role, and you got them doing the right thing. Like, sense of freedom. You're not, like, having to lead all the time because you've set them up for success. And so, yeah, that's what I mean by having that sense of freedom. And part of the reason why I know that lesson is because there are many, many times where I put the wrong people in the wrong place for whatever reason. We didn't have enough money. We didn't have the right person. And then you end up over leading, and you end up needing to lead more and more because you didn't hire right. And so sadly, I've had to learn that lesson as well.
For a leader listening today who maybe feels stuck using one leadership style, what's a practical step that he or she can take to start becoming more situational and adaptable?
Well, I think if you're listening to this podcast, you've already taken a step, because one, yeah, you're thinking about your leadership and then you're already like, you've got the concept of situational awareness, situational leadership in your tool belt now. So like, if you're listening to this, you're already, you've already taken a step. But if you're feeling stuck in your leadership style, like I said, like, that's okay that you have a leadership style and that you understand the principle. Like this lesson has to do with taking your leadership style and taking a look at the situation that you find yourself in and having situational awareness to understand, here's my leadership style. This is the situation that I'm in. Can you lead through that? Do I need help? I mean, just having these concepts in mind really help you to be effective as a leader. It helps you then to understand, like, this is my situation that I'm in and this is what I need in order to lead through this thing.
When we talk about this stuff, it makes me realize that great leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being flexible, about being creative, about
Yeah.
willing to grow, because every situation is going to be unique. So before we go, Dr. Lem, what are your final thoughts?
Man, my final thoughts is as a leader, you can continue to grow in your leadership with all the things that we're talking about here. And today it's taking a look at situational awareness, situational leadership, and then go back to your journal, look at all of your leadership things that you've done. And that's why you have your journal so that you can go back and reflect and evaluate, how could I have done this better? How can I help you do it better in the future? And so, I mean, just thinking about your leadership and just thinking about your leadership practice and then getting a better understanding of situational awareness in your leadership practice really will help. So thanks for listening and thanks for checking us out.
Awesome as always. And to my audience, if you found today's episode helpful and you want more leadership insights delivered straight to your inbox, be sure to sign up for our free Rising Tide Leadership newsletter. Every month, we share practical tips, resources, encouragements that are going to help you gain the confidence and the influence. And when we have these conversations with Dr. Lem, it helps you understand your identity, not just as a leader, but as a person. Make sure you like, subscribe, share. We just love being a part of this journey with you, and we appreciate everybody that reaches out and allows us to do so. Till next time, Dr. Lem, thanks a lot, brother. Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You got it, man.